In this lesson, we're going to be looking at how you identify and comment on the effects of specific language and structural elements in the 19th century prose fiction texts that you need to deal with on paper 1. You need to comment on specific language and structural features in response to question 3. So the aim of the session is that by the end of this lesson, you'll know specific language and structural features to look for. You'll know a number of different things that you can look for in these extracts. Obviously you won't find all of those features in every extract you look at, but they're the kinds of things that are likely to be in the extracts and the sorts of things that you'll be expected to pick up on and comment on in response to question 3. In addition, you'll know the correct technical terms to use for identifying those language and structural features, because it is a requirement of your response to question 3 that not only do you identify them, but you use the correct term when you do so. So that's the first level of dealing with these language and structural features. This is essentially feature spotting, identifying and naming them. We need to move beyond that, however, to be able to answer question 3 effectively. And you need to understand how to comment on the effect that the specific language and structural features you're identifying are having within the context of the extract in terms of creating meaning, maybe creating character, whatever it might be. So we'll look at the sorts of comments that you need to be making about those features. And then once you know the features to look for and how to comment on them, that will mean that you'll be able to go forward and provide effective comments about the effects of the specific language and structural devices used in the 19th century prose extract that comes up on the exam paper that you actually do. We're going to begin by looking at specific language features. So I'm going to introduce you to a list of specific language features that you can look for, and I'm going to tell you the correct terminology to use when you're referring to these. So the first group of language features to look for are figurative language devices, and there are 3 main figurative devices. And they're all used to create imagery within text, to build a vivid picture for the reader as they're reading the text. The first one is metaphors. Metaphors are used to make direct comparison between 2 different things, often 2 very different things, to suggest qualities about one thing by comparing it to another. Metaphors make that comparison directly, and they do not use any comparative connectives. Similes also make comparisons, but they make the comparison indirectly, and they signal the fact they're making a comparison by using either as or like as the comparative connective. So both metaphors and similes are used to make comparisons between different things to suggest qualities and create interesting images. Metaphors do it directly and similes do it indirectly. The other form of figurative language that you need to be aware of is personification. And personification is where we attribute human qualities or characteristics to inanimate things, to things that are not living, that have no senses. We might also attribute animal qualities. That's quite a common thing that we see in literary fiction and 19th century prose fiction. Okay, so that's figurative language. We then have this group of language that we refer to as being descriptive language. Descriptive language adds detail, it builds up atmosphere, it helps to establish character, it helps to create a vivid sense of setting. And descriptive language includes adjectives. Adjectives are the words that describe nouns, that add detail to a noun to make it come alive. It also includes adverbs. Adverbs essentially add detail about verbs. You can tell if you're looking at an adverb because most adverbs will have the suffix ly at the end, and they're often created by simply putting that suffix at the end of what would otherwise be an adjective. Now, adverbs are linked to verbs, so they describe verbs, but sometimes we find writers using a whole string of adverbs and using adverbs to describe adverbs, or maybe to add detail to adjectives. So you can have a piece of description that is very detailed with lots of different adverbs. We sometimes call these adverbial phrases, where you get lots of adverbs in there. And then we have what's called sensory language. Now, sensory language could be metaphors, could be similes, could be personification, adjectives and adverbs. But the key thing with this is that language feature is designed to appeal to one of our 5 senses. If you think about these 19th century prose fiction texts, the writers are trying to bring their story to life for a reader. They want it to become 3-dimensional, and the way that they do that is to include details that appeal to our sense of sight, our sense of hearing, taste, smell and touch. Okay, so we will often find a writer using at least 3 of the senses in their description, because that's a way that they can make that piece of description jump off the page and come to life for their readers. We need to pay attention to the verb choices in these texts. Verb choices can be quite interesting because verbs obviously are action words, so they're describing actions, events or possibly states of mind. We need to look at whether the verbs are active. If a verb's active, then the subject, so the noun that the verb is associated with, will actually be doing the action or involved in the action or feeling or experiencing whatever state of mind it is. If the verb, however, is passive, then the subject, the noun, is either observing or having something done to them. They're not actively engaged in whatever that verb is describing. Okay, so it's useful to look at those. It's also useful to look for any use of modal verbs, so the 9 modal verbs, and also to look for the use of imperative verbs, particularly within exclamatory sentences. So we start to see language and structural features working together. We also find in 19th century prose fiction quite a lot of use of dialogue. Dialogue is simply where the characters speak directly in a text. So we'll have a narrator that's giving us the story, that's telling us the story, and then sometimes the narrator will stop and we'll hear the characters' voices. We can tell when it's dialogue because it will be enclosed in speech marks. And because a character is speaking directly, that's usually being used to create a sense of what that character is like. So we often find that characters' dialogue contains quite a lot of colloquialisms. Colloquial English is just informal conversational language, sort of the language of every day. And within that colloquial language, we might find quite a lot of use of cliches. So phrases that we're very familiar with, but phrases that have been overused so much that they lose any impact and they lack any real meaning because they've been overused. Connected to that, we might also find the use of particular idioms. Idioms are words and phrases that are particular to groups of people. Quite often it's linked to a dialect or a regional area. So if a character is using idioms that you're not familiar with, it may be that the writer is trying to suggest that they're from a particular local area. Idioms can also be linked to particular professions or particular interest groups. So look carefully at the words and the phrases that are being used in the dialogue. So on your screen then you have a list of specific language features with their correct terms that you can look for in these texts. What we now need to do is understand why you have to do this. The reason you need to be able to identify and comment on specific language features in these 19th century prose fiction texts is because the writers are not always stating their meaning explicitly. A lot of our understanding of these texts is what we call inferential. We're essentially reading between the lines. So we have the text on the page, but that isn't the whole story. We need to interpret and to infer meaning by looking at a number of these different devices. Our inferential understanding comes when we get to the implied meaning, to the connotations within a text. We don't just accept the surface meaning, we start to dig deeply, looking at word, sentence and paragraph level and trying to work out what ideas the writer is presenting, what themes they're exploring, what their attitude is towards those. A lot of the time those implied meanings are present in the writer's use of specific language and also structural features. Things like figurative language, things like the way they write the dialogue, the interactions between their characters will create a lot of implied meaning. There's a lot of inference that we need to use when we're looking at those particular parts of texts. In your response to question 3, you are always going to be asked to provide a response which analyses how the writer is using language and structure. Okay, that is asking you to identify these specific techniques and look at the implied meaning, what is being suggested by this. It is not enough just to be able to say that there is a metaphor being used. You need to be able to explain how that metaphor is being used to create meaning in the context of the extract that you're looking at. You must identify specific language and structural features to be able to use your inferential understanding and to see these implied meanings. So it's really important that you become familiar with these as you work through the extracts. And question 3 is testing your reading for meaning skills. They're looking to see that you're not just reading superficially, you're not just skimming the text, you're actually paying attention to the individual words, the way that those words are linked together, the way the writer structures their text. When you come on to question 4, which asks for a broad evaluative overview of the text, you are also going to have to use inferential understanding to be able to comment on the particular aspect of sight that is referred to in the question for that. Okay, so we're going to go on and have a look at an example now. This is one we've looked at in a previous lesson. This is an extract from Charles Dickens's novel Hard Times. This is where he is describing the town of Coketown. So we're getting some very detailed descriptions here. So we'll have a look at what's going on in this extract in terms just of specific language features to begin with, and then we'll look at some structural features as well. Okay, so here's our text then. If we start to pull this apart, we can see there's quite a lot going on. At the beginning, we get this descriptive detail here, the use of the colours as adjectives, the red brick and the black. So colours being used as adjectives to make it seem dirty and uncared for. There's also repetition in there, which we'll touch on when we look at the structural devices. So we get the repetition of the same adjectives being used. We also get the adjective unnatural here to suggest to us that this town is not somewhere you really want to be, that people are being forced to live and work in an unnatural way. And interestingly, at the end of this first sentence, Dickens employs a simile to describe the town. He says it is like the painted face of a savage. So not only is it dirty and uncared for and unnatural, but that simile suggests to us that it's also wild and untamed and sort of a new frontier, if you like, a little bit like the American people going over to colonise America in various places and coming up against the indigenous people there. It becomes a dangerous place. We then get this wonderful extended metaphor for the smoke coming out of the industrial chimneys. It reinforces that sense of danger because we've got the interminable serpents of smoke that trailed themselves forever and ever and never got uncoiled. And again, we've got the use of repetition to emphasise the unending misery of this piece. Okay. When we go on, we see colours being used again as adjectives for the black canal, which ran purple with ill-smelling dye. And then we get this description of the vast piles of buildings with their windows, where there was a rattling and a trembling. Now, contemporary readers of this, so the Victorians that would have been reading this, would have been likely to have picked up on those verb choices, the rattling and trembling, as a reference to the old sort of lunatic asylums, the bedlams, the places where people that were severely mentally ill ended up. And they were horrendous places, and there were people sort of shaking the bars of the window and the trembling, the fear. So it's suggesting to us that this is a place of madness, a place that sends people mad because of the industrialisation that's taken place in here. He then develops that idea a bit further through the personification of the steam engine as an elephant, a melancholy elephant. And again, he uses a simile. It's like the head of an elephant in a state of melancholy madness. So that brings to mind an elephant in a small enclosed space, moving backwards and forwards, swinging its head backwards and forwards, suggesting that there's it's very restricted lifestyle. This industrialised town, this industrialised living is not good for people. So it's suggesting that people suffer when they have to live and work in these kinds of conditions. We then get the use of the contrasting adjectives, which should suggest variety. So we get several large streets and then many small streets. However, he qualifies that by saying that they're all very like each other and the small streets are still more like one another. And then he goes on to tell us that these streets are then inhabited by people equally like one another, who do the same job at the same hours, and it becomes very sort of monotonous. The style of writing reflects the monotony and the boredom and the dullness of this town. Okay, so there are a number of specific language features in this very short extract. Let's go on now and look at the sort of structural features that you need to be able to identify and comment on. Okay, so just like with the language features, there are a number of very specific structural features that you're expected to identify and comment on. First of all, we need to consider the narrative voice, the narrator, who it is that's telling the story to us. This is really important with these 19th century prose fiction texts, and you need to pay attention to this. You may find that you have a first-person narrator. If you have a first-person narrator, that will be a character in the story. You can tell if it's a first-person narrator because it will use the first-person pronoun I. And the effect of using a first-person narrator is generally to promote empathy in the reader with the character. So we accept that particular character's take on the events and the other characters that they're describing. First-person narrators, by their very nature, are limited, because we just get their point of view. It's one person's take on what is happening. Okay, the effect of that is to keep us guessing, and sometimes it's also to make us challenge the view that the narrator is presenting to us. Another very common narrator that you get is the third person narrator. This is not a character in the story. They will have more of an overview. They will refer to the characters by name, and a third-person narrator can be omniscient, which is often the case with these 19th century prose fiction extracts. And an omniscient narrator is kind of a godlike narrator. They're all seeing, they can see into the hearts and the minds of the characters, and writers use those to reveal the motivations of characters to readers. So we get a real insight, we get to understand why characters behave as they do, and we see things about them that the characters themselves are not necessarily aware of. Third-person narrators can also be limited, and we've seen an example of that in the short story The Necklace, where the narrator, although they were third person, although they were omniscient, they didn't, they weren't able to tell us any of the motivations of the character. We were just presented with the events, and we were left to make up our own minds about why the characters behaved as they did. The other thing that you obviously need to be able to comment on is the use of sentences. So you need to look at the different structures and the forms that are created and comment on the different effects they have. So just to recap then, in terms of sentence structures, we're dealing with the three basic ones: simple, compound and complex. Forms, you're looking for statements, questions, imperatives and exclamations. And generally you're looking at the variety of those. So if you have a character that uses lots of simple sentences expressed in the form of an exclamatory, then what does that suggest about that character? What does it suggest about their intelligence, about their attitude, about their personality? Look at the sentence structures and the forms and think about why the writer is choosing to use those particular forms. You need to pay attention to the pace of a text. This is sometimes linked to atmosphere, and it's basically how quickly the action moves on and what happens to move the action forward. So this can be achieved through the use of close description, which we have in the extract from Hard Times. This is where you get a writer focusing very closely on one particular thing. So in the extract from Hard Times, Dickens is zooming in and he's focusing on this particular town to give us a real flavour of what the town is like. Whenever you have close description in an extract, that is there to focus us and to suggest the significance of that setting, that event, that character, whatever it might be. So pay attention if you notice any close description in there. Look at the punctuation that's being used. Punctuation marks can be used to speed up or slow down the pace, to emphasise particular things, to also convey the way that characters are speaking as well. So don't overlook the punctuation. They are very valid elements of structure that you're able to comment on in the exam. And also look at the type of words that are being used. Do you have lots of single syllable words? If you do, that's likely to be increasing the pace. If you've got lots of multiple syllable words or compound words, that's going to slow down the pace and make it a much, give it a much slower, more lethargic pace, and you need to think about why a writer's doing that. Then we have a number of other key devices that contribute to the structure of a text. They're things that we find in prose fiction. We don't necessarily find them in literary non-fiction and media non-fiction, but sometimes we do. So the first one is foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is just an advance warning of something that's going to happen later to create tension and suspense and to keep the reader hooked and wanting to read on. And we saw an example of that in the extract from David Copperfield that we read, where the black dog tried to attack him at the end, which was foreshadowing the violence that he suffers at the hands of Mr. Murdstone later in the novel. Repetition is an interesting one because repetition works as an element of language, but also as an element of structure, because you can have repeated words, phrases, sentence structures. So if you've got any repetition in there, try to comment on it as both language and structure, because remember, you must comment on elements of language and structure in order to get above a level 2 for your response to question 3. And then we may find in these extracts what we call semantic fields. And this is where a writer will choose groups of words, phrases and images that are all linked by a common theme or a common idea. And that is something that we have in the extract from Hard Times. So in question 3, you're always going to be asked to comment on language and structure together. This is because structural features often work alongside and complement the language features. They help to add meaning to the language features. That is why if you only comment on the language features and you don't comment on the structural features, you cannot get beyond a level 2 because it's not showing really detailed understanding. You're not appreciating the fact that some of the meaning of the language feature is coming from the way the structural features are working to complement that. Okay, you have to comment on at least one specific element of structure in your response to question 3, and you need to not just identify it, but as with the language features, comment on the effect that is having in relation to the meaning within the context of that particular extract. Elements of structure can be used just as effectively to create connoted meaning, implied meaning, in the same way that language features can. So you have to use your inferential understanding with these structural features as well. And sometimes it's a bit harder with the structural features. So let's go back now and look at structural elements in the extract from Hard Times. So the first thing to notice is the repetition. Now I said that repetition works as both a language feature and a structural feature, and we can see this here. If we look at the start of each of these clauses, it was a town, it was a town, it was a town. The repetition, it creates a rhythm to this writing, and it's emphasising the urban nature of this setting. We've also got the repetition of the adjective red being used to connote a sense of it being hellish. It makes us think of hell. That's the idea that he's trying to get across to us. We then get these two incredibly long, complex sentences. These are typical of the way that Dickens writes, but it reinforces the monotony and the inescapable misery of the place. And then what we notice is that these are punctuated by lots of commas, so it almost becomes list-like, with him just listing all of the unpleasant features of this town to suggest that it's incredibly miserable and it's not somewhere that you want to be. When we look at this last sentence, we find again he's using that almost list-like feature, and he's using repetition, so he kind of uses all of the techniques that he's used earlier with the repetition and the listing and the complex sentence there to give us a sense of how boring and how dull it is to live in this town, and what a kind of essentially an industrialized treadmill it is for the people. And what we find in this text is that we have overall a semantic field of hell. So we've got references to red, we've got references to serpents, to the idea of it coiling around, to smoke, and the people are like the lost souls in hell. The river, the purple river that's running purple with ill-smelling dye, is like the river Styx, that people are carried over. And what he's trying to suggest is that these industrial towns are like hell on earth for the people that actually live and work there. Hopefully what you can see is that the structural features that I've picked out are in the same places, and in some instances the same things as the language features that we were looking at. So you can see how the structure complements the language features. Okay, so having identified specific language and structural features, you now need to understand the kinds of analytical comments that you need to make so that you avoid the trap of simply feature spotting, just listing all of the features that are there without actually offering any comment on the effect that they're having. So let's have a look at a question. This is a typical question 3. The first thing to notice is that you're directed to a very narrow line reference. You must make sure that all of your examples and all of your comments only relate to that line reference. Don't try and write about anything outside of that. You won't get credit for it. Okay? You need to focus on the section that they've asked you to look at. It then says, how does the writer use language and structure to? And then you'll have the focus of this question, which is highlight the conditions in the town. You're reminded to support your views with references to the text, which is reminding you that you need to provide a response in the form of a PED essay, and it is worth 6 marks. In terms of how you respond, you need to read the question. That's the very first thing you have to do. It sounds obvious, but people often don't. You need to read the question, you need to highlight the key words, so you need to highlight the line reference, and you need to highlight the main focus of the question at the end there, so that you know what you're being asked to analyse. You then need to go to the section you've been directed to and look at the most important language and structural features in relation to the specific focus of the question. There will be some features that you may have highlighted and annotated when you were reading the text that are not relevant to the focus of this question. If they're not relevant, don't comment on them. Only comment on the ones that relate to the focus of the particular question you're answering. When you are commenting on the language and structural features, make sure you name them using the correct technical terminology. That is a requirement of this particular question. And make sure you write your response in PED paragraphs. Okay, point, evidence, explanation, and then development. When you're writing your PED paragraphs, try to provide 2 pieces of evidence from the text to support each point. Those 2 pieces of evidence could be individual words within a quote that you break down. That's fine. You don't have to have long, lengthy quotes. And actually, they don't want you to use long, lengthy quotes. They want short, embedded quotes. Remember, when you're analysing, you're looking at word, sentence, and probably you might have a whole paragraph level. So don't use really long quotes. Try and break them down to the individual words. Keep your quotations very short and embed them within your own writing so they become part of the sentences you're writing. And make sure that you always explain the effect of every feature that you identify and that you name. You will not get marks for simply listing a whole load of features without explaining the effect. You will get more marks for a response that only focuses on maybe one element of language and one element of structure, but that you've explained in lots of detail, than a response that lists 6 or 7 elements of language by their technical terminology, but doesn't offer any explanation or any comment on any structural features. Okay, so let's have a look at a sample response to this question about the extract from Hard Times. Okay, so you've had a chance to read this through. So the first thing to notice is that the opening of this response is giving an overview of the specific language and structural techniques used. So commented on repetition, which is language and structure, similes and metaphors. Okay, as we go on, we can see that we're addressing the question. So we're talking about the conditions in the town. We're saying our interpretation is that people are living a monotonous and hard life when they're in this town. So we've used inferential understanding to get to the message that Dickens is giving us about this particular town. We're using P-paragraphs. We've got the quote broken down into individual words here. So we've got short embedded quotations with really detailed explanations on the effects that the language is having here. We're also making sure that we're using the correct technical terms. So we're talking about similes, extended metaphors, complex sentences and commas. We're not just saying the comparison or the long sentence or this bit of description, or the writer uses descriptive language, because that would be too vague. We have to use these precise technical terms. And when we look at this response, we can see that overall there is a good mix of specific language and structural features being discussed in this response. Okay, and it's dealing with all of the different ideas within that response, backing everything up with evidence from the text itself. So that is one way of providing an answer that meets the assessment objectives for question 3.